All right. Hello, Sam Dubé here once again for the Toronto Business Journal. And please join me in welcoming with us today Michael Cremo. Michael is the author of the infamous book Forbidden Archeology and its abridged version, The Hidden History of the Human Race, as well as the book Human Devolution. So, Michael, thank you so much for joining us here today. It's an honor to have you.
Good to be with you, Sam, and all your viewers.
I mentioned to you before in our brief chat that I actually am a fan. So I'll just say that for all transparency, being due here. And I remember picking this up, and I mentioned to you, I picked it up when I was at the Towards the Science of Consciousness conference in Tucson, Arizona, way back in, I think it was in 96. And it was a little restaurant named Govinda's, an Indian restaurant that had a bookstore and it was a little bookstore just attached to it. And I even used the business card as my bookmark. And you mentioned to me that you'd actually been there to that restaurant.
Yes, I have. I've been to that little Tucson. The restaurant is connected with a little ashram, a little spiritual center there based on the Vedic teachings of India, which have also inspired my work.
Yes.
So yeah, I'm familiar with that place, and also the conference Toward the Science of Consciousness. I think I went to do presentations there in 1998 and 99, I believe. So yeah, we got some synchronicities going on there.
So it's fate. It's that we were meant to speak today. So I'm a bit tickled by this opportunity. That being said, you are quite infamous in the world of archaeology. Oh, and also Human Devolution. I remember picking this up at classic bookstores.
Yeah.
Now defunct, the bookstore. But I remember picking this up because I've always been very interested in getting answers to the big questions, and you address some very big questions in both of those works. And,
yeah.
Right. So
yeah, I actually, when people read Forbidden Archeology, they began to ask me questions, because basically the book Forbidden Archeology is about discoveries of archaeologists and geologists of evidence that shows human beings like us have existed for millions and millions and millions of years on this planet, and not just for the 200,000 or 300,000 years that most scientists now accept. So after people read that book, they asked me a question. They asked, okay, you've got all this evidence that contradicts the current theories of human origins, the Darwinian evolutionary theories. Well, what are you going to put in its place?
Right.
So the book Human Devolution was my answer to that question. And what I proposed was, before we even talk about where did human beings come from, we should first of all ask, what is a human being? And many scientists today are going to say, oh, we're just machines made of molecules. As far as consciousness is concerned, well, it's just produced by brain chemistry, and it'll be finished at the time of death, and that's all there is to it. But I don't accept that. I believe each of us is an individual being of pure consciousness, which is totally non-material. It's from some other level of reality. And that's what we are. We're a combination of matter. We have a physical body made of the chemical elements, but there's also a subtle mental body, and beyond that, the conscious self. And we've devolved from consciousness. We haven't evolved up from matter.
Right. And in fact, the old paradigm, or the more Western paradigm, was that consciousness is the epiphenomenon of matter. And so basically what you're saying is that matter is the epiphenomenon of consciousness, that we all came from pure consciousness. And then in a sense, it's like a trickle down effect in manifesting into the beings that we are today. And that's in your books, Forbidden Archaeology and the abridged version, Hidden History of the Human Race, you present actually a tremendous amount of evidence, some of which was very well received by certain people, and most of which was not well received by the archaeological community. But nevertheless, you have to admit, almost anyone has to admit, it was well researched, and you're very passionate about the topic. And so I was certainly looking for answers back then, and still am. And I believe there's a certain amount of veracity to many of the discoveries that you brought to the fore, because there certainly is a filtering of knowledge in science, and anyone who's been around it long enough, and I've seen it in math and in physics, more specifically in physics, the filtering of knowledge and the conscious and unconscious maintenance of a status quo, and I think you can certainly comment to that.
Absolutely. Sometimes people think, I'm proposing some conspiracy theory. It's not like that at all. Maybe a little bit like that, but it's something historians of science and philosophers of science have understood for a long time, namely that theoretical preconceptions, the fixed ideas that many scientists have, sometimes these things are called paradigms. That was a term that became widespread as a result of the work of Thomas Kuhn, a historian of science, who sort of introduced that terminology. But that serves as a knowledge filter, and evidence that conforms to the paradigm will pass through that intellectual filter, whereas evidence which may be just as good but which happens to contradict the dominant paradigm gets filtered out, which means you don't hear very much about it. It's not going to be mentioned in textbooks, but it's there. It's there for those who are curious enough to actually dig it up.
Exactly. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, which I've decided to do and made a career out of it.
Yeah, you certainly did. I remember you mentioned your initial research. It took you 8 years, and it was done as a project with your friend and colleague, Dr. Richard Thompson, who was by trade a mathematician originally, and I have something in common with that. And you guys worked together on this, and it's been kind of a lifelong endeavor now. But what I wanted to say was that you've illustrated very clearly that the underpinnings of the theory of evolution are weaker, I think, than most people realized. They're actually considerably weaker. And that there was a period where there was significant evidence that was circulating that contradicted these underpinnings, and that eventually these bits of evidence started to disappear. We're not here, as I mentioned to you earlier, to talk about all that. You've done extensive, hundreds of interviews on this in the past, on your books, on the book Forbidden Archaeology. So I didn't want to talk about that today necessarily, but when you were talking about what it is to be human, and you said that we were beings of consciousness, pure consciousness, I'd like to focus in on that right now, if we could, Michael. And so could we talk a little bit more about that and the concept of this devolution that you talk about in your book? I think it was published in 2003. Could you explain to us, to the listeners, the viewers, what you mean by human devolution?
By that, I mean, originally we're beings of pure consciousness. That is the fundamental reality. And the nature of that realm of pure consciousness, where there are limitless numbers of individual, personal, conscious entities. And the nature of the place is that they exist in loving harmony and cooperation. Now, if a conscious self isn't fit to exist in that kind of environment. If a conscious self manifests desires to control, dominate, exploit others, and engages in all kinds of activities in furtherance of that, these selfish, egotistical goals, then there has to be an alternative reality for such personalities. And that's the world we live in now, the material world, you could call it, or universe. And when a conscious self comes to this level of reality, it requires a vehicle in which to function. And there are many types of material bodily vehicles that a conscious self can occupy: plant bodies, fish bodies, insect bodies, animal bodies, dinosaur bodies, human bodies. The human body is considered special because it gives the facility for the conscious self to understand, no, I'm not just a machine made of molecules. This is the idea that's being taught all around the world today in the different education systems. We are beings made of molecules. Consciousness is just some byproduct of brain chemistry. And on that basis, people identify with bodies, their color, their nationality, their gender, their religion, they divide themselves up into so many competing groups. And that is the meaning of devolution, that the conscious self has kind of come down from that higher level of reality. It's become identified with temporary bodies made of matter. And because of that, we're destroying our planet. We're creating the kinds of environments that result in pandemics. Yeah, because when you destroy the habitats of animals and things like that, then diseases start spreading from them to human populations. At least that's one theory. I mean, there may be other explanations for it, but or you get so much conflict between races, between groups of people with different religions and different nationalities, different class structure, the rich against the poor against the rich. It's all a result of this process of devolution, the devolution of the conscious self from the realm of pure consciousness to this level of reality, where we engage in so much competition and we work just to produce and consume more and more material things. And in the course of that, wealth is generated, and certain segments of the society appropriate that wealth for themselves. But if we were thinking, I'm a being of pure consciousness, you're a being of pure consciousness, we're all beings of pure consciousness, there's no need to divide ourselves up into so many competing groups. Let's just satisfy our material needs in the most simple, natural, efficient, and fair way possible, and put most of our human energy into developing the resource of consciousness.
Okay, I got lots to discuss there, Michael, because you're describing basically the volume being turned up over the last few years, especially now, 2021, during this pandemic. You can see things, for instance, the racialization issue. And you and I spoke very briefly earlier about things maybe happening behind the scenes that we're not really aware of. So I just want to go back now for a moment, because you make no bones about it in your works. In Forbidden Archaeology, you mentioned that you were motivated by the Puranas, the Vedic literature that talks about humans being in existence in their current form or physical anatomical form for tens of millions of years. And then some of the criticism leveled against you has been about, well, you were religiously motivated. And it's like, well, wait a minute, hold on a second. Who wasn't religiously motivated in making certain scientific, assertions or discoveries, or performing certain research, right? I mean, this is prevalent throughout history. And even today, in people who claim to be atheists or non-spiritual or purely scientifically minded, there is a culture. There is a culture, and there are subcultures where people get, so into believing something that they go and they, it does bias what they do and say and what they investigate and this and that. And I mean, science.
It's a metaphysical position that they're taking.
There you go. And regardless, right? And we're seeing these metaphysical positions now that I don't know if I even want to call them that, but some of them are really scary. And then in producing so-called, science. Science it's a methodology, it's a protocol that's only as good as the people doing it, right? And so we all have these biases. So you should be judged based on your work and not necessarily why you did something. The question is it good science? Is it good work? So that criticism doesn't mean a heck of a lot to me. But when we talk about, so you talked about the Puranas, and then you elaborated on that in Human Devolution. It was a book that was probably a decade coming, because I think you mentioned that you were going to produce something back when you originally published Forbidden Archaeology, and then it was like 10 years later that Human Devolution came out, and maybe it just wasn't the right time. Can you comment to that? Or
well, I try to be very thorough in whatever I put into my books, whether it's Forbidden Archaeology or Human Devolution, and that takes time. I sometimes wish I was more of a prolific writer, but I like to put something together where I'm satisfied that I've done my homework, I've done my research, and I'm correctly presenting it in a fair way. So, and I think whatever reputation I've gotten is because of that. I mean, I'm speaking about people who really appreciate my work. I think it's because of that I think that they feel the way they do.
So that's fair. And I did want to address this concern. And that is, I think there's an irony out there, because you talked about this devolution from, the pure consciousness throughout time and space. And what is happening today is something that was actually predicted in Vedic literature: the turmoil, the social turmoil, the physical turmoil, and in fact what we're going through today in its entirety. But when we use the word transhumanist, so I'm wondering if there's an irony here, because there's this emphasis on the development of AI. And we talk about how China wants to have the best AI on the planet, and that a lot of what they do, including the use of TikTok, was to actually gather tons of data, right? And they still have this goal, and they admitted this, right? They admitted that wanting to develop that. But then what is AI? And then you talk about consciousness. And so my comment is, okay, in pursuing AI, where we're trying to transcend or improve the human to the point of being superhuman, like with, say, Elon Musk's embedded chips in your brain, or biotechnology, dare I say, genetic engineering, et cetera, which may be very relevant today. Could that be seen as devolution, because we're not paying attention to this aspect of consciousness. And in fact, we have researchers saying, oh, it should be very easy to produce artificial intelligence, and wham bam, thank you, man, you make it complex enough and you do this and you make it simulate a human brain enough and boom, you've got sentience. But is that a reality that, I can't identify with that?
Yeah, you're making a really fundamental point here, because everything in science and philosophy and whatever, all these different fields, basically it boils down to a choice between two alternatives. Is matter primary or is consciousness primary? If you go look at the history of science in Western Europe in 5 or 6 centuries ago, at a time when what we call modern science was arising. And they made some fundamental decisions, like at the Royal Society in London. Many scientists, if you go back to that period, they were involved in researching things related to consciousness. They were looking at alchemy. They were looking at all kinds of mystic powers and subtle energies. And some of the scientists, they just decided, okay, let's just focus on ordinary matter and how well we can describe it without invoking any non-material substances or subtle or vital energies. Let's just stick to the building blocks of ordinary matter. Let's not talk about any higher intelligence having any influence on it. So they decided, okay, that's how the game is going to be played. Those are the rules. No non-material substance, no higher intelligence involved in it. And that was very successful in this sense, that they learned a lot about matter, what its nature is, how it behaves, how to control it. And as a result of that, they developed technologies. That ability to control matter gives them the ability to, at first, just come up with improved weapons, improved consumer products that corporations can sell, and pharmaceuticals, medicines, that can be marketed. And the governments liked it, because they wanted all this stuff. They wanted the economic activity that goes along with it. So everything that we're seeing today, the genetic engineering, the artificial intelligence, the development of vaccines that involve RNA and other genetic activity, it all kind of comes from that strain of thought. So it was very productive in some ways for the scientists involved, and the people in general were kind of complicit in it because we like all the gadgets, the smartphones, the cars, the rockets. We like all that. So we're kind of complicit in it as well. But at what cost did they do this? By ignoring these other aspects of reality that have to do with consciousness and vital energies and forces. They've developed a whole medical system based on these manipulations of matter and molecules, but they've ignored the self. They've ignored consciousness. They've just excluded it. And because of that, there are so many problems in society and in the world of science. They haven't really come up with any good explanation of how consciousness can come from matter. They haven't really explained the origin of life. It's considered an unsolved problem in biology. And we've been able to market and produce all the technology that comes out of that scientific research. And you got very bright people working at that. But still, there's racial conflict in America, for example, and other parts of the world. There's class conflict. The 1% taking all the wealth, the others being denied it. There's these pandemics that are becoming more and more common. And there's so much dissatisfaction among the people all over the world. Nobody's really satisfied with it ultimately, but they just keep going on and on in the same direction. And that's what I mean by devolution. That's one sense of the word. And yes, you mentioned that in the Puranas, which are the cosmological writings of the ancient Vedic culture of India, talk about a sequence of ages going. It's like you have in a year. You have spring, summer, fall, winter. So the age we're in now is like the winter age, where everything kind of freezes up. It's going to get it's predicted to be an age of desertification. In other words, climate change, which people are very concerned about. Yes, it's going to be a time of environmental disturbance. It's going to be a time of social disturbance. It's going to be a time when governments will exploit the people more and more. It was predicted that people will just, to avoid all the government control and excessive taxation and everything, they'll run off to the mountains and the forest if they can. So, yes, but yeah, just because it's going to rain, it doesn't mean you have to get wet. There's always an opportunity for us to refocus, to concentrate, individually, give ourselves an opportunity and give others who we care about, the opportunity to start on another path.
Okay. Do you have any practical advice to start on another path, Michael?
I would say spend some time each day focusing on the conscious self and its nature. For that purpose, there are different systems of yoga and meditation that come from the East. And then there are systems of contemplation and prayer that come from the West. And here I'm not talking about the external forms of religious practice, which seem to just generate conflict. I'm talking about systems of practice that center the mind in the conscious self and just appreciate and understand one's own being as a being of pure consciousness, and try to see it in others, not only just people, but in animals and plants, birds, fish. There's a conscious self in each of them. I think people see that, especially those who have pets, dogs, cats. They realize that's not just a robotic machine. There's a conscious feeling self there that we appreciate. So I think those things are very important. And then simplifying one's material needs as far as possible is helpful. spending some part of the day contemplating works of literature that help one become a more consciously aware person, and not just letting your attention be totally absorbed in the news and everything that's just trying to make you afraid and scared and willing to comply with the direction of those forces in society that just want to keep everything the way it is and even exacerbate it and intensify that. So,
Well, Michael, you're eliciting some thoughts in me now. I have to mention, like, you're almost giving like an explanation for the basis of the work of other people who I respect. For one is Dr. Joe Dispenza. He was originally a chiropractor, and he's done some real work in meditative practices, mindfulness practices that elicit real change in a person's physiology. So he first appeared in that movie, What the Bleep Do We Know? He was kind of famous for appearing in that movie, and then he admittedly went through a personal crisis at that time. But what he believes is that we've fallen too much into the trap of just considering the material, as you mentioned. So that when we look at a disease like cancer, we got to find a cancer gene, and we have to cut out the tumor. I mean, there's a radiotherapy, there's chemotherapy, there's alternative therapies there, and surgery, and alternative therapies as a fourth modality. But he has done some pretty interesting research in the area of mindfulness. Is just such a basic term for what he's doing, but in literally changing the mindset or the emotional set or both to alter the physiology. So he actually has, produced some exercises and things that an individual can go through, much more than mindfulness, in order to change your reality, your physical reality. And so I have to mention that this reminds me of when I was a child and I was being taught the transcendental meditation technique, because I remember meeting the Maharishi when I was very young, and the same Maharishi of the Beatles fame, right? And when the instructor was talking to me about thoughts, and that thoughts are the true cause of our reality, that consciousness was the root of everything, and she likened it to a little gas bubble at the bottom of a lake, and then growing bigger and bigger and bigger, it comes to the surface. And when it comes to the surface, that is a conscious thought. But there's this whole realm of unconscious and subconscious activity and superconscious activity, in fact, going on. So this is like you're presenting a basis for all this stuff here. And I forgot what I was going to say, and it's probably a good thing because I want to let you talk. but but when I think that oh yeah, that's it. There seems to be almost like two main movements, and that one is we're so caught up in the material stuff, and we're looking to manipulate the material to the point where we're masters of our perceived reality. But then there's another movement where we're using it to complement a more, shall we say, spiritually or consciousness oriented point of view. I was listening to Huberman's podcast. So he's a neuroscientist. I think it's Dr. Andrew Huberman, and fascinating because he talks about how behavior and thoughts can change your biochemistry, can actually just taking action. So we're not just these bodies that are subject to the whims of some, puppeteer or even just a mind, but that you can resist certain urges and take action, and that will produce certain hormones and increase certain hormones and biochemicals that will encourage that behavior later. So it's a give and take from both sides. And I think there is this movement where we are looking at the support for the consciousness perspective and acknowledging that we are this, I don't want to call it a shell, because I believe in the interchangeedness, between consciousness and the body. They're two sides, two aspects to the same coin, I think. But if you focus solely on the material and get obsessed with that, I think you're in for some destructive times and some destructive consequences. Do you have a comment about my very long-winded comment?
No, no, I think you're on the right track. Yeah, yeah, that's. Uh, but yes, so I mean, those are also very practical things. But I think you're right. Things can be used. Material science and material technology. I think there is some appropriate level where those things can go hand in hand with progress in a towards a more consciousness oriented social system and lifestyle. Yeah, I think that's possible, but it's sometimes I just reflect. Everything has been monetized.
Yeah.
Sort of, it used to be like somebody would go to work, and at work, then they have to consider the monetary factors, like how much am I earning, what are my expenses, how much value in monetary terms am I contributing to my employer and everything. They think like that. That aspect of life was monetized work. But then people thought, okay, now I've got my leisure time. That's mine. I'm not working for the company or the government or whatever. I've got my time. But they're so intelligent, they figured out a way to monetize your social life. And therefore you've got, these social media platforms that are just dedicated to that. So I think at a certain point, one has to somehow or other center oneself a little bit and not allow oneself to be exploited and monetized and just have your whole life turned into a factor on somebody's spreadsheet. So
okay, so let's
but
go one
that's
step
not
further.
but that's not to say that there's no role for these things at all. It's like many things, it all comes down to balance. If whatever one's involvement with material reality is if it's contributing to your progress as a conscious intelligence person, as a person, as an individual, and you have more positive effects on the people you encounter and other living things, then it's good. But if it's distracting you from that goal, then something has to be done.
Okay, so bringing up my old point about transhumanism and how it seems to be really focused on the material. Do you feel that there's been a concerted effort to eliminate or to suppress the idea of human volition, consciousness, or even that of a soul in our modern society today, being the year 2021?
Absolutely. I think there are certain elements within, there are political institutions, there are scientific institutions, there are financial institutions, there are all kinds of institutions, even religious institutions, that are heavily invested in this system of trying to dominate and control and exploit the material resources in 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 groups in competition with each other. Somehow that has become embedded in our whole worldwide human civilization, so that uh, we have decided that to produce and consume more and more material things is the real purpose of human life, and everything is organized to facilitate that. And as far as what you might personally believe, well, if you want to believe in a soul, go ahead, but just do your part in the system of material production and consumption. I think if you go to the education system, to the scientific presentations, yes, they do tend to take people away from this idea there might be something more than matter. And they're heavily invested in that and don't seem to want to change very much. But as individuals, we can change.
You talked about social media being an attempt to monetize, leisure time or off the clock from work.
Social life.
Yeah, social life. And but I'll go one step beyond that. And now looking at how freedom of speech is being treated, what do you think is going on there? Do I need to be more specific? So, for instance, some of the big platforms actually deleting links and comments, all in the interest of, trying to halt misinformation, when it's actually quite clear that there's a favoritism, that there's a hypocrisy with what's being censored or deleted. What do you think's going on there?
It's just another aspect of trying to dominate, control, and exploit. And it's people get. I mean, they're intelligent, like young people who have some intelligence, who have some desire to accomplish something in their lives, who want, comfort, who aren't, totally selfish or desiring to do anything that's going to harm anybody. They get caught up in these institutions and corporations, and when that happens, then they find they're going to have to make compromises with maybe some deeply held values that they have, but just for the sake of it, that's necessary. So it's really going to require some revolution in thought, but we're going to have to learn how to live in a different way. But it requires, like demonstration communities, I think. And there are a lot of people in the world today in various countries who are trying to form alternative communities based on something other than this rampant material culture, that we see what it's resulting in. So it's a little. I mean, everyone wants to be an individual. Everyone wants to think that, yeah, I'm gonna be fulfilled on some level by my activities, but missing that point that we're not actually the material bodies that we happen to occupy temporarily. I think that's a key.
Okay, so then you talked about being mindful. You talked about, I asked you about practical steps people can take, but it seems difficult. Like I stopped watching mainstream news years ago, mainly as a side effect of my television blowing up one Friday night. And I never replaced it because I wanted to see if I could go without it. And after 2 days of intense withdrawal, I did survive. So, guys, you can't survive without a TV. But I became very selective about where I got my entertainment and news sources. And this was many years ago, and I'm glad. I'm glad that happened. I'm really glad that happened. Because you can easily be bombarded by messages if you're not careful, and there's definitely you want to talk about misinformation. There's who's infallible here, right? Who's infallible? Depending on what station you watch, what company owns what news station, you're going to get a different take, and what political party is affiliated with what company or news station. And I think most people are aware of that. But what can you do to minimize that effect? Do you know what I mean, Michael? I mean,
Yeah, I think ultimately, to me, the answers to those kinds of questions depend on appreciating the right of each person to make up their mind and have their opinion and their view of things. And I think that mutual respect for others, and I'm speaking in general, of other genders, of other nationalities, of other races, of other political persuasions, whatever. If someone is not trying to forcefully impose their ideas or concepts on others, then I just try to understand and appreciate them. And as far as my own ideas, all right, if I really evaluate, what I'm doing, I have to think, is what I am trying to put out, is that going to help or hurt anyone? And I also have to be careful that I don't try, in the name of helping or saving or whatever, use force to impose my ideas on others. I think that's very important. This attitude of not trying to impose or force or compel someone to accept what I'm saying. Let them just hear it. And if they agree with me, fine. If they don't, respect that. It's one thing that I've seen about the current education system is that, especially in things related to science, the origin of life, the origin of the universe, the origin of consciousness, they're reflecting the views of part of the scientific community. So what's generally happened is, there is actually some diversity of opinion in the world of science. You could say most scientists or biologists accept the Darwinian theory of evolution, but there are a few who are pursuing alternative ideas. And so it's like, but the government, it gives a monopoly to the majority view, and all other views are excluded in the education system, which means they're forcing something on people. It means, okay, just like in a parliament, okay, there may be a small party, a green party or something. It's not in the majority. It's not going to be running the government, but some people will vote for that little party because they agree with its principles, its ideas. So like even in the world, so just because you're a minority party doesn't mean you should be not allowed into the parliament. You can't take a seat because you've only got two people that have been elected. You can't be outlawed just because you're small. So I think it operates in the same way in science. There may be researchers and scientists who are small in number, but they have a right to be heard. But the governments, what they do is they give a monopoly to those who are in the majority, and everything else gets pushed out. So education policy is a whole big issue because it's formulated in different ways in different states or provinces or areas, but I think what really should be done is that, the textbooks of biology, for example, should say most scientists today accept the theory of evolution as originated by Darwin, but there are some who are proposing alternatives like intelligent design and this or that. And here's the reasons they give for that. And, give the theory of evolution most of the textbook pages, but in some segment of the textbook, some small segment, maybe 5% of the pages or 3%. It should be neutrally and objectively presented, but there are some alternatives. And then let students make up their own minds about it. It's, you could say, this idea of compulsion. And to their credit, I think some of the governments are not compelling people to take, vaccines, for example. They're still saying, okay, you can not do it, even though they're really heavily pressuring people to do it. So I think that's one way out of the situation that we're in. This ability to respect a person's freedom of conscience, freedom of thought, freedom of expression, as long as they're not trying to force or compel other people to toe their line.
Wasn't it Benjamin Franklin who said those who would sacrifice freedom for safety and security deserve neither? And so, looking at what's going on today, much of it is in direct contravention to what you've just stated, right?
Yeah, there does seem to be an element of, maybe it hasn't fully manifested yet, but uh, there does seem to be an element of compulsion and force.
Why do you
And
think that is?
well, it's the nature of life in the material world. So we could talk about what I refer to as the realm of pure consciousness. And I mean, you could express these things in religious or theological terms. You know, I could say the level of the liberated soul, souls free of contact with matter. But if I mention the word soul to someone, they generally think, okay, that's religious, that requires belief. I'm kind of into science and logic and reason, and their minds just kind of turn off. But if I say conscious self, who can deny that? I'm conscious, I'm a self, everyone has the same understanding. They're conscious, they're individual, they're person. So if I say conscious self, it's, I think, easier for many people today to appreciate it. But the same thing could be expressed in theological terms. If somebody wanted to do it, you could say heaven or whatever. But in a sense, that tends to be in the realm of belief and faith and so on. But I think even just rationally and logically and on the basis of experience, we can tell we're uncomfortable as individual conscious personal beings. We're uncomfortable in our current situation. I mean, why are people upset about the coronavirus? They're upset because they feel it threatens their existence. So as conscious beings, conscious individual personal beings, we are actually eternal, but we've forgotten that. We think, okay, we're a material machine made of molecules, and you can break or disturb that material body made of molecules that we're in. So we feel threatened. But why do we feel threatened? It's because deep down inside, we really are conscious individual persons apart from matter, apart from the body. And because we're not in our natural condition, we feel threatened by the virus. And I mean, so there has to be a place where the conscious self can exist and not feel threatened by the changes that matter must always undergo. Any material thing, it comes together as a combination of elements. It persists for some time, and then the elements disperse. So I think that lies at the root of like concern with pandemics and other things, because if we weren't feeling inside that we're really not meant for that, for disease, suffering, death, if we really inside didn't feel that we're meant for something else, we're meant for eternal existence, then who would feel threatened by these things? All right, it's just another set of molecules interacting with the molecules in my body. Who cares? Because I'm just a set of molecules. The virus is another set of molecules. They come, they go.
I see what you mean, but that's really reductionistic, I think, and kind of boring. There was the statement made, I don't remember how long ago, that a philosophical tenet was you can't prove or disprove the existence of God, right? But when you err on the side of the material, there are certain assumptions being made. We're always making these assumptions, right? Like if, for instance, in the Vedic tradition, consciousness was first, right?
Yes.
Consciousness is first. And so if you can't prove or disprove that, then what's the harm in making that assumption? Do you know what I mean? And then proceeding from there with your science, with your investigation of the universe, and keeping that at least in the back of your mind, and having a respect for that. And then all that comes from that, right? Which you were talking about respecting the individuals and their voice. And this is what's happening today, is not only is the voice not being respected, but people are in conflict over what appear to be very material concerns, like you were saying, my race or how I identify. I mean, are these not more material concerns when we're all these consciousness or energetic beings? And it's almost like the modern society is playing into those more material concerns, and even leveraging people based on those material concerns, without me getting more explicit, for fear of us being shadow banned. And I've been trying to be careful about that right now, obviously, because I want people to hear you speak. I want people to hear your ideas, Mm-hmm. So where you mentioned that there has to be this big transformation that has to occur. Where do you see us going as a race right now? Where are we headed, Michael?
If we look at the direction things are going, it would appear we're headed into a period of environmental destruction. Maybe all the governments in the world are going to get on board with climate control and keeping the temperature down. But thus far in the history of the world, things don't seem to work like that. I don't think they can work. It can work like that until the governments of the world come to understand the principle of consciousness. Like I said, everything, whether it's government, philosophy, science, social life, it all comes down to the choice between these two things. Is matter primary or is consciousness primary?
Right.
If you believe that consciousness is primary, you will organize your civilization, your economy according to that. And it won't be the same type of thing as if you have an economy and society and science and philosophy that's based on matter as primary.
Right.
And that it really just comes down to something that basic. So I think if they understood, I'm a being of pure consciousness, you're a being of pure consciousness, we're all beings of pure consciousness, we're all part of the same family, and we're not Chinese or American or Russian or French or whatever, with our own material identification, because I've heard some of the speeches at some of these climate conferences, and it all comes down to, well, but yes, we'll try to cut down our CO2 emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, and methane emissions. But what about China, or what about this country or that country? Are they doing it? And if it comes down, if you still maintain this materialistic focus, if it comes down to people living more simply and naturally, in other words, voluntary simplicity, accepting that there's going to be changes, things aren't going to go on the way they were. When it comes down to like a conflict between, all right, we should try to do that, but no, we want this, we want that, we have to have it, we can't do without it. What's going to win over? If your focus is on, you'll take the material aspect of it.
But Michael, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, if this whole starting point of consciousness is seen as a religious point of view, or a belief that's completely, not up to, the mainstream standard of being completely secular, and, then how will we ever shift to that perspective? Like right now, there's active discouragement of, worship, with certain restrictions and things, and there's talk against certain denominations and religions that, you wouldn't have imagined 50 years ago, right? And it's
okay. I think you've hit on a very important point, and this comes again to the idea of everyone can have their truth, but nobody has the right to force it on someone else, on who you can. So I think quite rightly, some of the governments in the world have become secular because their experience with religion, and this is a real experience, is that it's a bunch of competing, fighting groups who are going to try to impose their views on everyone. And this gets back to what I call exclusive claims for truth. If you have the idea that only I and my group have the truth, and we have the duty to enforce it on everyone else for their own good, what you wind up with is conflict among religions, violence, like in England, a few centuries ago. This idea of a science apart from spirituality and everything like that came about in a climate where there was a huge civil war in England, with people being thousands and thousands of people being killed because the Protestants and the Catholics or the this group or that group, based on their religious idea, and that they could try to enforce it on everyone. They were just tired of that. Okay. And I think that's happened all over the world, where you have different religions with exclusive claims for truth trying to impose their truth on others in violent, vicious ways. So intelligent people kind of decided, okay, we're going to have a civil society, a secular society, separation of religion and state, because the religions that they practically experienced were a cause of violence and disturbance in society. So, all right, we're going to calm this down. We're going to, have freedom of religion. Everybody can have it. But what they wound up doing is making a religion out of science.
This is what I'm getting at.
Material science. So
this is what I'm getting at, Michael.
Yeah. So and imposing that on people by force. So
so this is happening pretty much everywhere, right?
So there should be separation between science and state.
Wow.
Just like there's separation between religion and state.
I think there's many claims that are being made in the name of science, but they may not necessarily be the best science.
Right. Well, I'm basically speaking about scientism, where you have within, even you go back to the time of Darwin in England and in Europe. Darwin started out believing that God created everything, each species independently. And he became the proponent of the idea that no, God wasn't involved in it. They just evolved one from the other. So he had a pretty strictly materialist ontology. But there were other scientists who were still adhering to Judeo-Christian metaphysics. There were some scientists like Robert Owen who were operating according to a Platonic metaphysics, where they saw the forms of animals and plants as reflections of Platonic forms that exist on some higher level of reality. Then there were various German scientists who were operating on a metaphysical concept that there are subtle energies, vital forces that operate on the biological form of the body. And in other words, there was metaphysical diversity in science. They were all scientists. They had different metaphysical positions. It was only around the time of World War I the turn of the century, that science adopted its present strictly materialist metaphysics to the exclusion of any other. So I think what's happening now, even in the world of science, is that metaphysical diversity is starting to come back into it, because there are scientists who've decided, okay, we've been working on this question of consciousness, how it came from matter. We've been working on it for 150 years. We still no closer to a solution. Maybe we've got to go the panpsychism route. That matter itself possesses as one of its qualities consciousness.
Right. Yeah.
So it's, or even in physics, when they start proposing things like dark matter, dark energy, things like that, they're adding something to the ontology of science. Used to be just, okay, the chemical elements, that's it. But there may be other forms of matter, they're starting to say. So again, I come back to the principle of toleration of diversity.
Well, you won't get
by the majority.
Right. Yeah, certainly that's a very old idea of this embodiment of spirit and everything, to some level. And I mean, there's even well, I won't get into that. I was going to talk about Hamroff and Penrose, but when
yeah, I'm familiar with Hamroffs.
Yeah, they were at the conferences, right? They were
yeah, he was kind of like the main organizer, right?
Yeah, Stuart Hamroff was an anesthesiologist. I only spoke to him briefly, but he and Roger Penrose formulated their theory, their microtubule theory of consciousness, where they proclaimed that the actual consciousness mechanism occurred in the microtubules of neurons and involved the shifting of energy levels of electrons in water molecules, and that the number of neurons you had directly reflected your level of consciousness, and therefore a clam with 3 neurons would never achieve the consciousness of, a cat or a human. Well, that's debatable, but the idea was that you get this coherence in shifting quantum energy level shifting in these electrons, and that caused a localized warping of space-time a la quantum gravity, which caused the organism to be aware of itself. But it was really a fancy mechanism to say, well, here's what we think is happening. We don't have a working theory of quantum gravity. This is a really complicated mechanism, so that's got to be it. But it was a complicated way of saying, this happens and we get consciousness, which is pretty much what people have been proposing for, decades, if not centuries, of other mechanisms. It was just, that was the cutting edge physics mechanism that they could propose, right? But it didn't really explain consciousness. It just proposed a much more complicated and subtle potential mechanism for this subjective experience, right?
Which is consciousness is still an epiphenomenon.
Right. Exactly, of matter, not the reverse, which is what the Vedas purport, right? And I'm sure there's other spiritual traditions as well. And this is the issue when you say it's a spiritual tradition rather than a fundamental, a fundamental presumption or a fundamental mechanism. Then you get people saying, well, no, that's not secular. That's your belief. And then it leaves itself open to being persecuted or being censored or being deleted, right? Because it falls in with all the other stuff, right? Oh, this is going to be as bad as Christianity, and this is going to be as bad as, radical Islam,
Okay.
right? Can you hear me okay? Can you hear
Michael?
Can you hear me? Michael, can you hear me?
Now I can hear you.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Right. So, Michael, is there? Yeah, sorry, the internet connection was a little bit unstable. I'm getting an error message right now. So, I think you and I could talk for a long time. I find.
Yeah, I hopefully you can pull out a few sentences here and there from what
Oh,
you
stop being so
reported.
modest. My goodness. I'd love to interview you actually about forbidden archaeology. I'd love to do that sometime, and maybe some new insights that you have, because there's always discoveries being made. I'm absolutely fascinated by the idea that there may be multiple proto-human bloodlines contained in the modern human, right? And different configurations, different constellations of proto-humans, depending on your racial and ethnic background, more so your racial background, right? So
Sure.
it was once an announcement made that Asians and Caucasians have up to 2% Neanderthal DNA, but people of African, sub-Saharan African descent, that's not the case. So there may be some subtle differences in our backgrounds, and yet we can all interbreed, right? So we're the same species, right? And that the Neanderthals weren't necessarily hunted to extinction. Maybe there was some of that going, but we may have bred with them. We did breed with them, and I think the current timeline is like about 50,000 years ago. So, but it's like this tree that you get these relationships appearing, and and changes and pruning of this tree of relationships between modern man and these different branches. Some branches don't seem to go anywhere, and other branches get connected all of a sudden. And you comment extensively on that in your website. Different
Yeah,
modern discoveries.
yeah, in forbidden archaeology. Let's see. What I want to say is that in the years since forbidden archaeology has been published, archaeology, anthropology, they've been moving in the direction that we laid out in that book. Because at the time the book came out in 1993, they were saying humans have been around for about 100,000 years. And by 10 years later, the next decade, 2000s, they were saying 200,000 years. And now, the next decade, like getting into the 21st century, they're now at about 300,000. Mm. So they're kind of going in the right direction.
Yeah.
And then the other idea that we had was coexistence of hominin types at the same time. And at that time, they had a kind of unilinear concept that you get Australopithecus, then you get Homo habilis, then you get Homo erectus, and then Neanderthal, and then archaic human, and then anatomically modern humans, kind of like in a straight line. But now, like you said, they accept coexistence of various hominin types, different branches. So they've kind of been moving in the right direction. But I want to congratulate you for asking me questions that I don't often get asked on my media interviews. It's probably why I wasn't as glib as I usually am. You have to think about things.
Well, that's a high compliment coming from you, Michael. Thank you so much. But I didn't want to run an interview like you've gone through, and I do believe that you have something very valuable to contribute, because you've written some really fascinating stuff, and with the human devolution in particular, I think is highly relevant to what's going on today. And I think we only really touched on, admittedly, I tried to avoid being explicit about certain things because I want this interview to get out there. And as we know, that there's a danger of that not happening.
Yes,
So I
that
forgive the
is
viewers.
that is that is true.
Yes. So for those of you that know me and seen other interviews, so please forgive me if you've seen that I've been a little bit reticent in my words, or I seem to have avoided certain things because I want the interview to get out. I want Michael to be known and to show that his work is relevant, very relevant for today, 2021. Okay, and the very old ideas that he has brought to the public, and I think the ideas are, especially important today with all the things that you've said, Michael, today regarding the respect and regarding the assumption of consciousness as a starting point and all this. And if we can just apply these ideas, then a lot of the conflict that's going on takes on a particularly, I don't want to say devoid of meaning, but it casts a new light on these points of conflict and get replaced with something I think more intrinsic to the nature of humanity and the universe.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you would like to talk about, Michael? Something you've never talked about before that has, popped into your consciousness recently? I'm sure there is. Please go ahead.
I have to think about that. Something totally new.
Well, it doesn't have to be. I mean, just like, do you want me to cue you with some words? Like brain implants, a la Elon Musk. Do you have thoughts on that?
I think the brain itself is pretty complex, probably more complicated than any chip Elon Musk would be able to put into it. And again, this comes back to the point that, as far as I'm concerned, this is the way that I look at it, is that this human body, like any other body, a plant body, an insect body, fish body, is a vehicle for a conscious self. And that being the case, we have to marvel at the complexity of this machinery of the body. It's much more complicated than anything Elon Musk can come up with. And I think that there can be problems with this kind of technology because, in addition to the gross physical body, we're connected to that gross physical body by a subtle mental body, which has some very unusual powers. And the conscious self identifies with the mental body, which is then connected to the gross physical body with all its chemistry. I think Elon Musk probably doesn't understand how those are all connected with each other. So maybe he does. Maybe he's a spiritual adept or something. Maybe he's...
We don't want to judge, right? We don't want to judge.
A secret sage or something like that. He's originally from South Africa, right?
Yeah, I think one of his parents was Canadian, but there's Canadian lineage, South African lineage in there. I forgot. I'm sorry, but yeah, South African.
Yeah. So anything that he or others might try to do regarding the human body is in terms of how it functions, by inserting whatever they've been able to develop by their technologies, is ultimately not going to work. I mean, you were mentioning transhuman before. Isn't that the idea? Does that involve the idea that gradually a lot of the biological organisms or organs, a lot of the biological organs are going to be replaced by manufactured
that's one
aspects of
possibility. That's how transhumanism is often interpreted in the name of improvement, right? But I agree with you that there are subtle connections and energies and such that are inherent in the, shall we call, technology of the organic human body, that and brain, that defy explanation at this point. And that it's like you take out a piece of someone's brain, what are you doing? Or you amputate a limb, what are you doing? I mean, I remember feeling guilty that I had my wisdom teeth out when I was a teenager, and I felt that, a part of me's gone. And then I spoke to a holistic practitioner named Chris Timms. Actually, I remember his name now. He said, no, the body has a way of adapting quite well, but it's just, you want to be careful about what you do to it. He says, I wouldn't worry too much about the wisdom teeth thing, but it was interesting that he said that there can be an adaptation. Because we're pretty resilient. I just don't know how far exactly that goes, right? And then when you talk about consciousness as a point of departure for healing, and you engage in certain activities like exercises by Dr. Joe Dispenza and other mindfulness practices that have documented cases of healing that would otherwise seem virtually, very unlikely or almost impossible, then it kind of makes you wonder, what is the extent to which a human can tolerate modification and regeneration, and so I wonder about this, but I don't want to take any chances, We're under incredible environmental influence all the time, and things that are in our environment that we don't even understand how they're reacting to us, but also your conscious state can affect that too. I mean, the placebo effect is, we just can't call it the placebo effect anymore because it's such a powerful effect. Your mind state and what you expect things to do, things that you consume or things that you're experiencing, how you expect them to affect you also determines the outcome, right?
Yeah.
So when you expect, oh God, I just got poisoned, does it make the poison worse? Does it make the effect worse? And there's some studies that actually show that that this is the case, where consuming certain things will have a different effect if you believe in their effect, if you believe in a different effect, right? So, but it's that's why I'm not for. I'm very skeptical of implanting, the chips into the brain, as you were saying, because we don't yet understand the full extent of the technology that is inherent in us, right? If you want to call it that, right? So, there's this danger of becoming too obsessed with the material. Some people might even say, Sam, you like working out and this and that. It's like, well, you're getting obsessed with that, with that aspect, that you become your body, right? And then there's the idea of body modification and like big body. I'm not talking about a tiny little tattoo. I'm talking about major body modifications. And we're at the point now where we can do certain things to the body to so-called enhance performance, and then Elon Musk's proposal is something even beyond that, and so we have to be very careful, I think, of how we engage in this, because is it from the perspective of consciousness, for lack of a better term? Is it from the perspective of the human form is a kind of an ultimate form, in that we manifested it from somewhere else or someone else, and that maybe we're not as closely related to the apes as we thought we were. Maybe there is much more there than we previously thought, and I think there's a danger there if we don't consider these things, that there may be a hubris, that will I think it's already happening, actually. So, just because you can do something technologically or biologically doesn't necessarily mean you should do it, because you may not have a complete understanding of the system. We will never have a complete understanding, but now I'm starting to get a little bit more dangerous and specific. But can you hear me? Can you hear me again? No. But I should shut up. All right. Maybe this is a message I should just keep quiet now, Michael. So I'm going to give the last word to you, Michael. So, is there anything else you would like to discuss? Anything that we've talked about that you felt your thought was not complete? Any other area that we haven't touched upon that you're eager to discuss? I'm happy to do another.
Well, I'd be happy to do another interview as well sometime.
May hold you to that.
You can hold me to it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm going to then bid you adieu on behalf of the Toronto Business Journal and myself, Sam Dubé. I would like to say thank you very much to Michael Cremo for joining us today, author of Forbidden Archaeology and Human Devolution. It's been really great speaking with you. I don't have any other way of expressing that other than just right out there. It's been great. It's been great. I've been wanting to talk to you for a long time.
Well, I'm glad you made it happen.
Well, you made it happen. We made it happen.
So,
thanks for granting the interview.
Yeah. There's other books of mine. I don't know if you've encountered them yet. Forbidden Archaeology's Impact.
Yes.
Have you ever looked at that one?
I have not. I don't have it, but I have seen it in a bibliography for you. I know it talks about the
reactions.
Yes.
And yeah. That's something. And then My Science, My Religion.
Yes, I saw that title as well. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, that's a collection of 24 papers that I've presented at archaeology conferences and some other topics as well, but mostly it's related to archaeology. There's a few related to human devolution and paranormal phenomenon and things like that. And it's been an experience for me, to present in those kinds of settings. It's really kind of fascinating to be there and try to present these ideas to people in those professions.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Basically, I just try to stay in touch with a lot of different audiences. The general public, the UFO researchers, the paranormal researchers, the alternative history and archaeology people, the mainstream scientists, because I think we're in the position where worldwide we're renegotiating our whole picture of reality, and all of these different groups, they have some input. So I just try to stay in touch with all of them. And
that's fascinating. In fact, I am very interested in these other aspects, and I think a topic I'd love to discuss with you sometime, Michael, is the evidence for the existence of something beyond a localized experience of mind. I'd like to talk about some evidence for
remote viewing. And
yes,
things
absolutely.
Like that.
Who was it? Hal Puthoff, who did some work with that. the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratory, when I read Margins of Reality back, I think that was published in '85, and I became aware of it through Charles Laughlin, who actually presented at one of the or a couple of the Tucson conferences, and he was loosely speaking, a mentor of mine in the area of consciousness way back then, and he was a transpersonal anthropologist, and he brought Margins of Reality to my attention. The husband and wife engineering researchers who believe they found proof of the influence of a directed intention on random and quasi-random systems. And it was a fascinating read, and I'd love to talk to you more about that, because that seems to be some pretty interesting evidence and the experiments, and they describe that. I'm not quite sure what the status is now. I know they had a website back up to 2006, and they disbanded it almost without fanfare. And I know the Russians were very interested in the research, and I know that they had some cooperative research done in New Jersey and in Russia because they wanted to get that distance for their experiments.
Yeah.
Right? So I think you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I do. Brenda Dunn.
Yes.
Like
Robert Jan and Brenda Dunn. Yes.
Yeah, Robert John, Brenda Dunn. Of course, Robert's no longer with us, but Brenda is still there, and she's, my spiritual group that I belong to, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, a long time ago formed a science and a science studies group, the Bhaktivedanta Institute. So they have a center in Gainesville, Florida. And about 2 years ago, they staged a conference on consciousness. They had the opening event at a big auditorium at the University of Florida at Gainesville. And Hammeroff was there. He spoke. Brenda Dunn spoke. Hammeroff, when he was going to university, wherever he went, his roommate was one of the members of the Hare Krishna group. I was a student at the same university, and they kind of became friends. So, and they stayed in touch with each other over the years, but it was kind of like, I think through that connection that he was kind of convinced to come and give a presentation about the quantum tubules.
Right. The
like
microfrequency of consciousness.
But, I met, Brenda Dunn and told her, I included some of your work with Robert John in human devolution. It was kind of a key thing, for one of the chapters. She said, "Oh, I'm aware of your work as well."
Wow.
And
I'd forgotten that connection.
Yeah. And then, she said, "Oh, can you come up to Princeton?" She's got a group up there.
Yeah. The Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratory. PAIR it was called, wasn't it?
Well, but I think what they did, I mean, that whole thing, with PAIR was the result of, I think, a contribution, financial contribution that was made by some wealthy person to Princeton to endow that. So at a certain point, somebody else kind of persuaded the person to stop their support. And, eventually the PAIR thing had to shut down. But they set up another organization to kind of host the work of Robert John. It was called Consciousness Research Laboratories or something. And she's with that now. But they have meetings at Princeton, so she invited me to give a talk there once.
At Princeton?
Maybe about 2 years ago.
Okay.
At her organization in Princeton. There's the university, but there's a city, Princeton, New Jersey, where the university is.
Yeah. I'll have to look that up. Wow, that's great. Thanks, Michael. That's a tremendous connection. I'm so happy that we talked about this.
Yeah. So, okay. Yeah, I'd be happy to speak to you again sometime for your programs.
Yeah, I'd love that, Michael. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
That would be awesome. So I'll tell you what, I'll let you go now. You've been wonderful, and I really enjoyed this experience. So again, on behalf of the Toronto Business Journal and moi, Sam Dubé.
Yes.
Thank you for joining us, and please stay in touch.